Welcome to the Restoring Our City podcast, where we have candid conversations on today's topics to help connect our community. And I am with the one and the only Jeswin Thomas, who I got to see a few weeks ago. Jeswin, it was great to see you in person, and we did not record anything. We were not productive at all with this podcast, but you were emceeing a wedding, my brother's wedding. Got to see you and your lovely wife. How are you doing, sir?
Great. I feel like I lost my voice the next day, but we got it back for this episode, and that's all that matters right now.
Yes. I'm so glad that we got to see each other in person, but it was kind of weird talking to
Yeah.
you face to face and not having the luxury of notes. And we have a lot of notes because, you know what? And the reason I'm so glad I got to see you and I got to see a lot of family. But you know what's one thing that I found interesting, especially as you go to weddings, is that there's people you haven't seen in a long time. And especially in our culture, people will say the most disrespectful things to you, like right off the gate. I walked around to like every table, people I haven't seen in like 10, 15 years. Their first comment was like, "What happened to your hair? Why are you not dyeing your hair?" I'm like, where is the honor, right?
Oh my
For
gosh.
someone with all this gray hair, it was just like, why don't you just buy, the whatever I forgot even what the brands are, Touch of Gray, whatever it is. But maybe that brings us to what I think that was pure evidence of the dishonor in our society and how people are so blatantly, and I'm kind of joking, as you hopefully can tell, but I think there's a little bit of a truth to how our culture today is more dishonoring than ever. And I think this is a concept and topic that hits close to home, especially in our society today. And I thought, Justin and I have been talking about this. Man, we should really talk about the concept of honor. And in our South Asian culture, we've talked a lot about honor and shame, but I think it's really important. Justin, do you agree with the statement that our society is more dishonoring of authority than ever before?
100%. I mean, authority and even each other, right? I think I go back to our episode called The Pursuit of Slappiness,
Ooh.
where we remember Will Smith walks on stage and slaps Chris Rock right upside the head during the award ceremony. And it's like, would you ever? No one's ever seen that before. And hopefully we'll never see it again, but we'll see. We'll see. As we go down this path of just feeling like we can disrespect and dishonor anyone, we don't know what the ramifications are. But that's definitely a marker that shows, 100%. We're definitely going down that path as a society.
Yeah. And I think we have to talk through this because there's so many practical implications, and I even think from a faith-based perspective, we're commanded to honor. And I think it's one of the Bible verses that if you grew up in church, probably learned as a little kid. And I think it's one of those things that we need to talk through. But at the same time, there are different perspectives on this concept of honor. And I think as we go into multiple episodes talking about different audiences of how we can honor them practically, we got to understand that there is differences, right? Like when we talk about honor from a South Asian perspective, it's really important, right? When we talk about to disobey is really to dishonor. And I think from that cultural perspective, that's one of those things that's really highlighted in our South Asian culture versus like the Western society, right? There's a little bit
Yeah.
more of a difference between honor and obedience, right? So I don't know
Yeah.
if you've seen that just growing up and maybe friends and neighbors that display this differently, right?
Yeah, I think that's something that we talk about a lot, even within our generation, right? That concept of honor and shame. We're coming from an honor and shame society. What we do has implications for the broader community. And even, I think one thing we hopefully will unpack either in this episode or maybe in the future of the series is honor and obedience equal, or if so, if they're tied together, like to what degree, right? I think there is some correlation there, but to what degree is just the question. How do you differentiate that is something we should definitely unpack, because it's something that we tie together, right? Like, how do you honor your parents? Well, you obey what the heck they say at all times.
Yeah.
And if you don't, it is dishonorable. Is that a true statement? I don't know. We're about to find out.
Yeah, you know what? It's interesting when you bring this concept up. Some of you might be listening to this and be like, oh, yeah, I honor everybody. I'm a good Christian, all that. But at the same time, just look around you, watch the news, and even some of the DMs that we get. And I think even just addressing how I've gotten some messages from people who are like, well, my parents act like this. Or what about this authority figure? Well, how do I respond to them? Because they're blatantly wrong, right? Look at society today and you'll realize that this is a big problem. And I think even us as Christians probably just don't even think about the concept of honor, maybe as some other cultures do, but like living in America and understanding this concept of honor, I don't think we talk about it enough. And it's so critical because of the way that we treat each other. And yeah, I think we all know, and you've heard it beaten like a dead horse, that we're such a polarized society, right?
Yeah.
But there are a lot of
Yeah.
facts, right? And I know we've kind of looked at some research, but there's so much evidence that shows that our culture and society today are a little bit more dishonoring of authority than ever before, right?
Yeah.
So,
I was gonna say though, but I mean, just to take it back, I think every single culture or even every single generation, maybe we'll put it that way,
mhm,
we have a tendency to want to rebel against
yes,
authority, right? That is just something that is within us. You probably see it within your kids. Joby, you're about to have a third, so you're going to see three dishonorable people that don't want to respect what you say.
that's
Just kidding. They all seem great.
pretty,
But, it's something inbuilt within us. It's something that's generational. But really, I think our premise right now is I think we're more dishonorable than ever before
yep.
in human history. And we are sticking to that claim. Um, and I think that that is the case. I haven't seen a generation that is so individualistic and
Mhm.
almost wants to build everything from the ground up to just match what they want than ever. I don't know if that's maybe the root of the problem, but I find that to be part of the problem. I think we're just so hyper individualized,
Yeah.
and even the acceleration due to social media, due to the algorithm sort of feeding us things that essentially bring us things that we want to shape our identity outside of just the communal things that we might have been born and brought up with, whether spiritually, culturally, or in many other things, that we now find those things to be worthy of dishonor, right? Like we
Yeah.
find those things to be distanced from rather than identify with. I don't know if you have a different diagnosis, but I think that's part of the problem.
I think there's some stats that we can maybe read through just to make sure that you guys know that we're not making any of this up and we actually do some research. But I love the fact that you brought up that every single generation does have an element of this. So we're not just saying that people never used to dishonor anybody and now we're horrible people right now, right? Because right when you said that, I'm thinking about like Rage Against the Machine, even just like
Yeah.
band names like Nirvana. And I think about Woodstock, right? Vietnam. Think back, every single generation has some group of people or cultural event in history that forced you to rebel against authority or stand up to authority and sometimes even dishonor authority. I don't want to make all those equate to each other, but there's those moments, right? Um, but I think there are differences in technology and individualization, I think, is really made this the hyper focus. So maybe let's look at thinking of
Sorry.
something.
As you're talking, I was trying to be like in the Bible, do we see dishonor anywhere? And if so, like where is it? The only thing that keeps coming to my mind is when the youths go up to Elisha and say, "Go on up, you bald head." And Elisha decides, you know what? I'm gonna bring a she bear and maul everyone here for the level of disrespect I received from these youths. But I digress. There's no
Yeah.
she bears about to attack us unless
Oh
the Lord
man.
wills it for the level of dishonor you have against
Well, think
His
about all the
people.
murmuring of the children of Israel in the desert, right? Like, I mean, come on. Let's go back to
Ugh.
Egypt, right? So there's always like something, right? So the human nature, the human condition does speak to this. But let's talk about now, today, 2025. There's some recent polls that have mentioned this concept. There is no fact on, hey, are we more dishonorable than ever? But there's also these attributes and data points that correlate pretty closely to that. So, for example, in the terms of government and church, diminished trust in institutions typically correlates with the perception of dishonor. So just thinking about that, you can see that in, I think, 2000 to 2009, on average, 56% rated clergy as highly honest and ethical. And today, it's down to 30%. That's crazy, right? Just even
The
like,
fact that it was only 56% in
yeah,
2000, that's basically half. Already in
yep,
2000, we say we don't trust half of people that are in ministry.
yeah,
Now it's only 30%. So it was not good, a few years before that, but it's even worse
it's just
now.
getting
And,
worse.
some of these things, I mean, some of the things, like, we have to be honest. I think there's some credence to this, right? We can't go through eras where we see, whether it's within the Catholic Church covering up issues
Yeah,
of abuse of children. You can go through scandals that we've seen in the Protestant community over the ages, whether it's Harvey Zacharias, whether it's the fall of so many prominent leaders due to sexual and or other financial sins, and then expect that we are going to honor and or appreciate and or respect the authority without being extremely skeptical. I think there's some like backing to this. I don't think it's completely unfounded.
Oh man, completely. And then you get all these Netflix shows about it or movies. I think about like the movie Spotlight. I think it won an Oscar and something,
Mhm.
right?
Yep.
So
Yep.
there's
Yep.
all of these media support, and rightfully so in some of these areas of cultural moments and spotlighting authority when they mess up, that further glorifies or even grows that distrust, right? So it's just
Mhm.
there's more avenues to understand these horrible stories and not put our confidence in these people. Just to throw out a couple more stats. So that's like church and government, in the government, right? 2024 poll said 22% of Americans said that they trust the US federal government to do what is right, always or most of the time.
Yeah.
22%. Um,
I
and
mean, we're
then
part of the other 78%. I don't trust the government to do anything right.
yeah, exactly, exactly. Right. Have you ever gotten your driver's license before? Uh, like, think about that, right? But the reason we want to bring up, so like, we're talking about church, we're talking about government. Think about parents too. A survey in 2023 said a survey of over 1,000 U.S. parents of children ages 6 to 18 found that a majority believe that in general, children are more dishonest, more disrespectful, less grateful, and lazier in the past. So wow, so much confidence for me as a dad. But like we wanted to highlight these stats because yes, there are some correlations here, but think about this. We're talking about honor, and who do we need to honor in today's society? We think about people in authority, like our parents, our family, our church, our government, people in our leadership positions, right? Across the board, it seems like there's this downward trajectory of trends of lack of trust, credibility, essentially honor in these people. And it's really not trending in the right direction, right?
Yeah, even with the parents, when you think about what are maybe some reasons that we find ourselves wanting to even dishonor them, I think a lot of times the way that education, media, TV shows, different things of that nature, it really says like, hey, the older generation actually doesn't know anything. They're not built for the modern time. They're not going to understand the issues that people are going through now, or even the openness that they need to have towards some of these marginalized things that we want to now, sort of elevate in our society. And there is such a way that I think society itself is causing kids to say, hey, maybe you shouldn't listen to everything your parents say. And really, you shouldn't trust or honor them in that way. Trust us. We're the experts. We will enable you, in whatever you want to do.
It's the craziest thing, right? Especially with media and just other voices. When being a dad, it's like I have a 6-year old now and he can understand certain concepts. But I've had to have this talk with them. I'm like, do you know for the rest of your life, there's probably going to be people who talk to you that have their own selfish interests in mind. And the only people right now in your orbit who care about you specifically is going to be your parents. Like, how can
Mhm.
you understand that we don't have any other incentive other than helping you be the best person you can be? There's no other motive, right? And to some extent, in every other facet of life, everybody has a motive or an incentive to get you to do what they want you to do, which can lead to this dishonoring when that messes up and that relationship breaks, right? And I think that's why
Yeah.
it's so important for us to understand these concepts and that not just to say, hey, it's a good thing to honor people, right? Like culturally. But wait a minute, all this ties back to our faith. It all ties back to this concept of what biblical principles are about, because then we can understand our faith better. We can understand the people around us better and live out like what God really wants us to be, right?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I mean, I think now we understand that there's a problem here and it's getting worse. But like we need to talk about this in terms of definitions and like understanding what are the concepts that we're talking about here. It's there's honor, but there's also shame that I hear about. I've heard this talked about at like a lot of conferences. We even talked about this on episodes before on this podcast. But how do we break this down, Jeswin? If we had to really define some of the key concepts in this theme, what would we break this down as?
Yeah, so really thinking about honor. We started off this episode and we kind of brought that at least question up: is honor equivalent to obedience? And I always think about the verse, children obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. so that I may go well with you. And there's a differentiation there, right? There is obedience that's told toward children, but honoring told toward adults that also have parents afterwards. There's two different concepts being shown there, right? So therefore, we have to distinguish. I think we all know what obedience is, right? Like you're taking action that is in compliance with whatever the authority figure says. And so, therefore, it can't just be blind obedience that's equivalent to honor. But still, even if you don't obey the voice of that person that's in authority, whether it's your parents or someone else, you're still going to contemplate, you're going to consider, you're going to respect them and what they have to say,
Hmm.
regardless of if you disagree or agree, or regardless if you're going to take their advice and apply it or not. So I think, the way that we're trying to define honor here, it's to esteem or value that you assign to someone. And it's rooted more in an attitude than an action. Whereas in obedience, you're going to take the action
Right.
more than what your attitude is. Hopefully that distinguishes both those concepts there.
Yeah. I think that's so important for people to understand because I could hear the question coming right now. I was like, why should I obey? Why should I honor somebody if they're completely wrong all the time? Right? Like, can I honor somebody or assign value, as you say, to someone that's rooted into an attitude or a posture towards someone, even if
Yeah.
they might be dictating wrong instructions to you? Right.
But even on the flip side, I think, sometimes we think about, you know, I'm not there yet, so I don't know what to say, but I think about some adults that are in their 40s and 50s, and you see sometimes marital problems where it's like, hey, no matter what my spouse does, like, no matter, sorry, my spouse's parents have an opinion on something, and my spouse always goes with what
Huh.
they have to say. They haven't really differentiated between honoring and obedience, or maybe there's just a fear of the repercussions, even as you're an adult and you're in an individual family unit. I think some of these things are so deep rooted in us that we have to sort of unpack it. There's one extreme where it's like we're dishonoring, but there is another extreme where it's like we're still just children obeying. We haven't really grown that relationship into adulthood and let it mature, you know?
Yeah, I mean, that hits home for probably a lot of people listening to this. Like, man, I see people who are full-blown adults still not honoring their parents. That kind of makes me a little sad too, because at a different phase in life, and for those of you who might be younger listening to this, this might not, the reality might not set in. But when your parents get older and like the time that you have with them, so limited, it's like, man, are you still acting like a 18-year-old, 19-year-old teenage angst against your parents? Or do you like, I love this time when I went back to see my parents for my brother's wedding and like having spending time with the kids. And man, my kids FaceTime my dad. And when I answer the phone, I'm like, hey, dad. And my kids just go up to my dad on FaceTime. They're like, hi, dad. Hi, dad. And they're not calling him grandpa. They're just calling him dad. I'm like, what kind of dishonorable? But my dad's face just lights up, right? Because he could see the joy just playing around with the kids. And so I just love that time, but like honoring them, right? But let's talk about the flip side because anytime you talk about Indians and honor, the concept, the tagline is honor and shame culture, honor and shame
Mhm.
culture. So shame is really the negative aspect of this, right? When we talk about shame, and I know we have some of these definitions that we're talking about, and one definition is the loss of honor and a
Yeah.
sense of exposure, and especially in the South Asian community, it is communal too, right? Because when you feel that sense of shame, it's not just because someone individually made you feel ashamed of something you messed up with. The whole community looks at you this way, right?
Yeah.
And that's scary.
And it is scary, but it's also very biblical, right? I think
Mm,
think sometimes when we read the Bible, right, we have to understand it's very much written in like an Eastern type of a lens. It was still a communal society, right? You think about the story of Jesus turning water into wine. That wasn't a license for us all to start drinking now. It really is a story of, man, this family that is at this wedding, if they do not have wine, it is going to be the talk of the town for who knows how long, but and they will be shamed, right? They will be like, how could you do this? Like, why would you throw a party like this and not account for what you needed? And Jesus steps in to take away their shame or their almost like at the point of dishonor. And that's really the purpose of that story, right? And I think even the gospel, right? Sometimes you think about it from a legal sense. We broke God's law, therefore we were going to get punished, but Christ steps in for the consequence. Well, that is a legal definition of the gospel, but we can also think about it from the flip side where we sinned and we brought dishonor to the name of God, right? We brought him shame, and there was nothing we can do to repair that, but Christ comes in to take our shame upon himself so that we can be honored and restored to a relationship with God again. So it's almost like we see the logical outworking of both of those, that Western and Eastern concept, come both into the gospel and even into these stories, and we have to be mindful of each of them.
Yeah, that's a great example. And it kind of brings me back, and I know we're not like, focusing on a specific passage on this episode, but I think the whole book of Romans comes to mind. And there's a really great article that maybe we can link out. But it's referencing this book called Reading Romans with Eastern Eyes. And this
Mm,
book talks about Paul's perspective on the book of Romans, but looking at it from an Eastern cultural lens. And the reason he does that is because he brings up this concept of honor and how it's played out throughout the book of Romans. And I know a lot of people use the book of Romans to, do the Romans road to understand sin and understand the gospel and how it saved us. But there's this great question in the article, and it kind of gives us this example. I want to read it actually. It says, when we look at honor, right, it might affect our theology. So consider this question. It says, what makes sin so heinous? We might answer that sin deserves eternal punishment because it's a legal offense against an infinite God. That makes complete sense, right?
mhm,
And that's actually true. But think about it from this perspective. So sin is also heinous because it's a shameful offense against the king who deserves our highest honor and allegiance.
mm.
Man, when I read that example, I'm like, wow, now I think about sin so differently because it's so bad because I'm sinning against the most honorable king. When I read that example, man, I thought about the times I would mess up in my life. But then when I mess up in front of my parents and my parents bust me, it's like a different level, right? I remember in high school when I messed up real bad and my dad busted me. And if he ever listens to this, I'm sure sometimes he does listen to these episodes. I get so nervous. That's the only time I get nervous recording this. But um, man, I remember when you talk about shame, I felt so much shame when I messed up. And my dad, to his credit, now being a parent, I don't know how I would have lost it, right? Put his arm around me and, said, hey, we're here for you. And you did all the things that probably most Indian parents probably don't do. But he also said something that made me even feel like this way. He's like, do you know what your mom's going to think? Like after we kind of made up, he's like, man, your mom's going to be upset. And I felt this weight. And it's because I felt sinning against my parents who I hold up on a pedestal, right? Like I'm totally dishonoring them. And so the shame of that really felt personal. And I think that's where, man, if we looked at sin in the light of dishonoring the most honorable God, man, I think it changes the way that we think about honor practically, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
100%. And yeah, I'm even thinking about, sometimes when we mess up and our reaction almost shows us that, right?
Yeah.
I think for me, especially, it's not that I feel bad that I did something wrong. It's more that I feel like I, as an individual, have so much to be shameful for that I can't even approach God with that, right? I think less about the legal offense of breaking something on the scales of justice, if you will. I think more of like the, oh man, this relationship,
Yeah.
it's not the same anymore, and it takes so long for me even just to get back to a place where I feel okay, right? And I
Yeah.
think maybe that's maybe a lot of us in sort of this performance culture sort of mentality, right? Like our parents always saying like, like you only got an 85. Where's the other 5? You could have got the A. And you almost have this perception of like, man, if I do all these things, that makes me an honorable individual. I graduated with the degree. I got the job. I got married at X time. I have all these markers of honor. And when I follow that path in some senses, I feel like, oh my gosh, like, hey, I am matching a level of status. I am worthy of honor. And when we fail at our own standards, we feel the dishonor, we feel the shame, both communally and even toward God, or at least I'm sort of in that boat.
Yeah, and I think maybe tying it back to, hey, there's a problem in our culture today, society, that is so dishonorable. Is it because they don't perceive the relationship to the people they should be honoring, right? If there's a lack of relationship there, and sometimes that's tougher, right? Like with the government, you're not going to know your congressman, right, by name sometimes, or personally have a relationship with them. But how do I get to a level of understanding that those people are people, and we have to have relationships with authority? And maybe that disconnect kind of feeds into the ease of being dishonorable, right? Like there's no relationship that's
Yeah.
just easy for me to disrespect and not be accountable to authority.
It's hard because I think, like you said, like the accountability to authority, there's no relationship or disconnect there. But I think it's harder when society says, you don't have to feel shame about anything. You
Sure.
can do whatever and you don't need to feel shame. I think that's where it becomes almost dangerous, right? When we are our own standards of honor and shame, I think there is something almost extremely wrong there, because I do think we don't know how to be in relationship to authority in any senses, whether it's our parents, government, uh, you know, even God, right? Like if we don't have a sense or a framework that says, hey, we relate in terms of honor and shame, then what do you do?
Yeah.
Because you don't even have the concept of like, how do you honor?
Yeah. And so if society is removing even just a component of shame and like, hey, you don't have to feel bad about anything, right? Then there's no way that we can practically grow or even like be aware of our own sinful nature, right? There's like
Mhm.
everything is forgiven. Everybody gets the participation trophy. Well, good luck. You tried, right? Like there's elements of that, right? And maybe
Yeah,
that's a. I never looked at it that way to say, hey, is can shame be positive? Can shame
100%.
actually have some positive effects here?
Yeah, I was gonna say, that's maybe one thing as Christians sometimes we might skew, and I know I brought this on a previous episode where guilt and shame, sometimes we look at it and say, hey, Christ died for this, therefore don't feel these feelings, right? Like, oh, you sinned, you don't have to feel guilt and shame. Like Christ died for you, and therefore you're always in right standing with God. Yes, that is 100% true, but I always see guilt and shame as like the proper response to sin, right? If you don't feel it, you have a problem.
Hmm.
And more than that, you see God uses it as a refining tool, right? I think if you feel guilt and shame for a prolonged season of time, I've definitely been there in things that I've done with my own life, but getting nuggets from, pastors that have led me to even say, hey, sometimes God will allow you to feel these things for a while so that you develop a proper distaste for your sin, right? So that you learn how to properly honor Him, honor yourself, honor that relationship. You have to learn how to hate your sin, how to not, feel or do things that bring shame, and you properly have to feel that sometimes. And I do think shame is not as bad of a thing as sometimes we think it is.
Yeah, it's almost like that's the impetus for us to grow, right? If we do not understand how bad our sin is and how it actually separates us from God, then we don't see how valuable he is, right? And
Yeah,
then we don't place him in that position of honor because we don't see the distance between us, right? And maybe
but
that's the analogy, right?
yeah, but even in at 100%, even the distance between God. But I also think about, sometimes when we grow up, and we'll talk about it maybe from a Pentecostal lens, sometimes we think about, well, when we go to church, what do we have to do? Get up, wear my suit, white shirt, tie, probably, come to church, clap my hands, do the thing. God. Okay. So there's this concept of like, well, if I don't do some of these elements, like there is shame that we bring out. And this is a very performative sort of
Uh-huh.
example and probably more on the unhealthy side. But you think about it, I think it's good to have a concept of like, this is what honorable Christians do. We are the ones that are the first to repent. We should be the ones that are knowledgeable about like God's word. We should be the ones that esteem the community and don't just skip out for any and which odd reason, right? And at the same time, when we see a brother or sister in shame, we're the ones that like run to them first. We cover their sins or we call them out if we need to. Now, I think I bring all of that sort of up where if we become so individual that we don't have a concept of like this is what an honorable Christian does, is what an honorable Christian community should look like,
Mhm.
right? Then I think there's a problem because we also don't know how to, once again, not just relate to God, relate to one another. And we also don't know when we bring shame to the entire Christian community. I think a lot of, and not to belabor the point, but we've seen a lot of things on social media recently.
Yeah.
And I do want to say like social media very much is an extension of yourself, and I see so many Christians not having a tame tongue on social media with what they post, whether it's political, whether it's, and I think political is a big one more than anything else,
Right.
where they just want to call out any which way. There is no thought or a pause or, be very, slow to speak and slow to become angry is just not a thing that exists in that sort of subculture on social media.
Mhm.
And therefore we don't understand, like, we are bringing shame to the community of Christ by the way that we are displaying ourselves
Yeah.
on social media itself, right? Do you kind of get that, Joby? I don't see us having the concept of shame because we don't understand this is not what Christians should be doing.
Well, let's see. I think I agree with you. And I think part of the commentary is people commenting on other Christians that they perceive to be Christians for dishonoring their faith too. So then they go out on social media and spew some toxic stuff about people who they perceive to be like the whole Christian nationalism and all
Yeah.
the, this argument gets circular. And it's like, well, I don't think you're a Christian because you behave this way, and I'm going to tell you, right? And so now you're dishonoring my faith. And the way I'm going to tell you that you're dishonoring my faith is by dishonoring you, right? It's like, there's this weird perpetual hate circle that's like, wait, I need to call everybody out. But like, we don't have and I think this is part of honor, right? Like, we, if I'm honoring somebody, right, there's a lot of self sacrifice in that. I'm not going to get the profit or the gain or something when I honor somebody. It's almost like I'm bestowing that honor on somebody, right? And a lot of times when somebody doesn't behave the right way, maybe I don't call it out. Like maybe I call it out in private. I don't have to call it out publicly. And maybe that's the social media toxicity that we see. And but there is something weird that we just do not honor each other. And yeah, I don't know. I think it gets circular, and then people just lose all sense of, yes, you can have your convictions, but then the way I actually share it should be honoring that person, even if you think they're dishonoring you, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
but
Yeah, I'm just trying to think, kind of back, and you make valid points, right? Like you don't want to match dishonor for dishonor,
right,
but part of me also just thinks, we also don't want to stay silent when we think again like our Christian like witnesses at stake, especially to an unbelieving world, right? And I always think about even examples in the Bible, right? Like when Peter is showing favoritism, in some senses, he is dishonoring the Gentiles by not eating with them. And Paul comes and is like, bro, you're dishonoring, and he calls it out. Why? Because at the end of the day, he is dishonoring in some senses like people made in the Imago Dei, and essentially he's dishonoring the Lord with that example. So I always think about, and maybe it's just the problem I have right now
sure.
because we're in such a hyper polarized political setting where I see it so much, and I always think about what is my responsibility in this, because I think these people are just bringing shame to the name of Christ,
Yeah,
and I don't know if I should be silent on some of these topics.
yeah, but you know what? I'm glad that you bring up some of these concepts, and like I immediately think about the Japanese culture and how there is the samurai code. I think it's called the samurai code of Bushido. But like when I think about like self-control, like taming my tongue, there's people who are going to offend me, but do I actually have the self-control? And these are some of the principles of the samurai code. It's loyalty, courage, self-control, often at the expense of personal desires. Like I could probably call you, and like a samurai is probably the most disciplined warrior who can cut your heart out, right? But like at the same time, has the self control not to, right? And maybe even just that culture of honor is, when to speak out, and sometimes not all the time, right? Like, all the stuff that's happened, especially in our society today. I'm glad that we like waited a couple weeks to even just put some responses out or like talk about some things, and maybe that self control is a component of honor that we probably need to practice a little bit more because we just want to be right and we want to correct things that we think are dishonorable to us. When in fact, when we actually do respond, um, we are being dishonorable ourselves. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
It's so funny self control and not to go out too much of a tangent here, but I think that's right, right? And I mean, when you said self control, I just immediately thought of the fruits of the spirit. If you think
yeah.
about someone who is honorable, right, that they're going to exhibit the fruits of the spirit, right, like the love, joy, peace, patience, gentleness, kindness, goodness, self control is all part of that. And sometimes, I mean, maybe this is something we should all be mindful of, right? Like, if that is what maybe the spirit defines as someone who is growing to be like Christ, which is worthy of the most honor we can have, do I exhibit that in person or even online? Am I spewing things that are bringing love, joy, peace, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self control? Or probably not, because it's not going to go viral if I do those things.
Well, I think, yeah, I think this all ties together, right? Because people are afraid of others dishonoring the name of Christians, right? In this example. And then how do I respond to that? Well, I don't have to fight for that honor, right? Like Christ already
Mm,
did that. But how do I honor others, right? And I think it kind of goes multiple ways. Like we're going to get into this in this series. And I think we need to dive into it practically because how do I honor God? How do I honor my church? How do I honor my parents? How do I honor the government? And as I say, all of those people and those groups of people, you're probably thinking of all of those ways that those people hurt you or were 100% wrong and is not worthy of honor, right? And I think we have to break it down because if you don't get this concept of honor, we can talk about honor and shame all you want and people and how do we like deal with these emotions. But like, I think we have to get to this level of how do I practically honor? Like, what does it actually look like? I loved our conversation with Nathan John a couple months ago in our connector series. And he talked about that concept of just honoring the older generation and just a practical example of him like, hey, let's just even giving the seat for older
yeah.
people to sit down, right? Conceptually, how do we do that, right? How do we actually honor God? Like, if I had to generally say, like, how am I honoring God? Am I just obeying him because, like, all right, get baptized when you're 13, right? Like, there's no verse in the Bible that says that, but sometimes, like, in our practical churches, am I honoring God because I just obeyed and followed the crowd? Or am I actually honoring him with all my heart, like in everything that I do? Like, am I generous in everything I do? In every area of my life, not just like financially, but am I generous? Am I actually practically living it out? Because I think of him so highly that I don't obey just out of fear, but I obey him because he's worthy of it, right? And I think we got to
Yeah.
change our perspective because if we do that, your social media posts will look different, right? The way that you treat others, the way that you even give would be different. The way that you even think about hosting somebody to your house would be different. Like everything that we practically do would be different. And I think that's such an important thing, not just to have a conversation about, but practically talk about ways that we can live it out, you know?
Yeah. And I mean, you hit the nail on the head. Like, how do you live it out? Because I think, like we've sort of maybe been hinting at it this episode or maybe talking about, it's, the logical outflow of honoring God is going to be practically shown in how we're going to be honoring others, especially those God has placed in authority in our lives. So just thinking about, man, even my own, that starts first and foremost, therefore, is like, how do you honor God, right? Like, and God, in my life, I think that comes back to sometimes it's always all the basics, right? Do you spend time with someone that you want to honor? Do you esteem his word, right? Do you get into that? Do you show, that love toward his people, his community? Um, for sure. And then thinking about other practical ways that we want to honor him. I think one practical way that kind of comes to my mind is some of the decisions that we've taken more recently. I think um when I say that, part of the decision to stay in Chicago over moving elsewhere, um, is really due to the fact we wanted to honor God with this decision. I think practically it made a lot of sense to move, get a bigger house, be closer to family in other areas. But from an honoring standpoint, we felt really called in the ways that God is growing us, growing others through us here, the ways that we're kind of discovering our calling, and even potentially delaying some stuff in our lives in order to grow more in Christ. And that's one way that we almost are practically trying to honor God. It's not just saying, hey, God, here's all of our plans and therefore we're going to execute it. Just go ahead and sign off on it. It's more like, okay, God, like, here's our plans, but are you okay with it? And you wait, and God says no. And it's like, okay, then we're going to be okay with where you want us for now,
Mhm.
and we're gonna try to live it out. I don't know if you have any other examples like that in your life, Joey, but that's one that came to my mind.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting. Just recently, we've had people over and started talking about like, why did you move to Dallas or why did you do this? But and there's a lot of different reasons, but I think even just the way that we honor people in general, we might not even think that we're honoring people, but the way that we treat people that we respect. And I think respect has a lot to do with this concept of honoring. Here's a really dumb example in corporate America. Okay. We go to a meeting, and if there's some big wigs on the meeting and nobody comes on camera, like most of the time we're on camera. There's a group of people that don't come on camera. When there's a big wig who comes on and they're on camera, guess what? All the people who typically don't come on camera turn their cameras on. Why? It's like, ooh, and then people have made these comments. They're like, oh, this person comes in, shows their weight, and then everybody falls in line to show face. Not even that they have anything to say, but they flip their cameras on because they want to show almost this respect, right? And I think about that. Like, how often do I show up when God enters the situation, right? And like, do I actually respond or do I like try to sit in the background and try to hide? Like, just even showing up, how do I respect God, and like how do I honor others and maybe show that reverence to others? Whereas when God wants to introduce or interject himself in an area of my life, do I actually figuratively turn my camera on? Am I actually like listening so he can see me listening and being intent, right? I it's interesting how the way we treat and elevate others when we think about elevated positions of worthiness, right? And do I actually elevate God in those areas of my life? And it's that's kind of convicting to think about and even talk about out loud. It's like, oh well, a job is separate. If I go into a big meeting, am I actually praying about it before I go to this meeting to deliver this message? Do I actually think
Yeah.
God cares about this dumb spreadsheet that I have to like speak about, right? And maybe he does. And there's some things that I think we just need to make him worthy and Lord over areas of our life. Because when he is, wow, what a way to honor him in every facet, right? Um, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, this idea of respect is so compelling that I want to dive into more of that too in each of these areas. But it's such a convicting concept when we think about how much we don't honor God, right?
Yeah. And it's funny, as you were saying that episode with the camera, I was thinking about and it's not one that we're gonna dive into, but teachers, right?
Yeah.
Man, back in college, I cut class left and right just to go to the gym and play basketball. It was a
Uh-huh.
great thing to do instead of going to class. But I was convicted. I was listening to, one of our college pastors was saying a sermon once, and he said, if a teacher were to pull up a roster of their class and look at your name, would they even know who you are, let alone that you're a follower of Christ? And I'm like, man, right? Like when you're talking about honoring God first and foremost and how that shows up, I'm like, man, me not going to class is dishonoring God and dishonoring my title as a Christian because this teacher will have no if I'm the only point for this teacher to know what a Christian is, then they're probably gonna be like, yeah, it's a lazy person that like cuts class all the time, right? Or it's the person that's there, shows up, is relatively engaged. And from that point on in my college career, I always made it a point. I will go to an office hours, I will introduce myself, I will at least try to make a connection because that is part of how I needed to honor God in
Mhm.
my life as a student.
Yeah, that's a great example. And I think about all the lecture halls that are like, 100, 200 people. Then in the middle of the semester, you know, it's half that, if that. I remember
Yeah.
walking into a lecture hall and I'm like, I don't want to do this. Like 2 minutes later, I just turned around. My teacher called me out. It's like, oh, so not that interesting to you, right? And I was just like, ooh, caught me. So I
Dang.
kind of had to sit back down. But it's just one of those things. That's a great example because we don't honor the people that he's put in authority over us, and like that we can actually learn something from it. Maybe how much are we missing out on
Yeah.
like what God has in store for us by dishonoring those he's put in our lives, right? Like, do we actually
Yeah.
think he didn't put these people in authority that you hate so much or that you don't think are suitable for the positions? Like, we could all have our opinions and probably legitimate gripes, but that doesn't negate the fact that he's still sovereign and control. I mean, we'll dive into all of this, but I think this is why this is so important. We wanted to set the stage of honor and the culture of honor that we need to get back to as a society, because that's going to be the foundation, not just because we need to be a better society and stop like yelling at each other all the time, but
Mhm.
because biblically that's what we're called to do. And if we actually live it out, think about what our communities and generations to come will be, right? They'll treat each other differently and probably be a healthier society, right? So,
Yeah.
lots of practical steps coming up, but we'd love to hear your opinions on this. So please send us your questions on areas to explore. But we'd love to kind of go through this series and really highlight some of these groups of people and positions of authority that we should be honoring a little bit better. So, uh, Jeswin, I
Sorry, as you were saying that, just, I don't know what episode we're gonna get to, but when the question comes, we're just gonna have to ask question, should I honor Trump? And we're gonna have to tackle that in this
yes,
series.
yes. Is he your president? Have you figured out some loophole that you are a citizen that he's not your president? Like these are the
Uh,
types of questions that we get, right? But even from a like the parent one, I think we want to talk about an episode about honoring our parents, and then even honoring our church too. Like, what
yeah.
happens when they're completely wrong? And I know a lot of us have dealt with church hurt. That's probably been one of those big things.
Mhm.
Can you still and should you still honor your church leaders even in some of
Yeah.
these situations? I think these are all important things that we have to wrestle with because it's a
Mhm.
reflection of us as Christians, right?
Yeah.
Um, and how fast should you clap your hands when you go to a worship service? Like, are you
85
dishonoring
beats per
the
minute.
music team when you're? I think about
85 beats unless you're filled, then it's 125. Oh man, we're gonna get
we need
canceled.
to get like a metronome or something like this. Yes, totally getting judged. You're dishonoring your worship leaders by not clapping
Sorry,
fast enough.
Jason.
Right. Um, I'm excited for the series. Would love to hear everybody's feedback and questions on areas we got to tackle. But looking forward to this, and hopefully we are not dishonoring anybody by doing this series. I think that's one thing we just want to make sure we're actually being respectful. So,
It's
Jessamine,
okay.
please help
If
me
we're
out with that.
disrespectful at the end of this, again, if we have dishonored anyone this year, please forgive us. We're gonna say that on December 31st.
Yes, that's coming up. Man, watch night's coming up sooner than you know it. Never know.
Yeah.
So, all right, Jessamine, looking forward to the series, man.
Yep.
All right,
Same.
see you guys.